Over hundreds of experiments, we've tested beers made with brewing practices that sometimes go against conventional wisdom. And often when we serve those beers alongside a second beer brewed the right way, participants fail to detect a difference. But is there a compounding effect going on here? If we incorporate enough of these brewing practices that go against convention in a single brew, will we have built a subjectively bad beer? To find out, I'm brewing a compounding flaws pale ale, a beer brewed with 4 practices that many consider flawed. And I'm then serving the beer to Brü Club member Will and asking him, how bad is this beer? This episode is sponsored by Yakima Valley Hops. More on them in a bit. So I am brewing today a pale ale. I love that style, the maltiness and the hops together, just perfect. But I'm going to do it by including 4 flaws, deliberate flaws in my brewing process. And we're going to see how they compound when you put them all into the same beer. And we don't need to get very far along in the brewing process for the first flaw to show up, because it's right now and it's to do with this water. Now, in here, I've collected reverse osmosis water. What is that? It's basically water with almost all of the mineral content stripped out. Typically, you would add minerals back in at this point to build your water profile. I'd normally add water salts like gypsum or calcium chloride. If you don't do that, I think we're going to notice something in the mouthfeel of the beer, but it's also going to affect the brewing process of the beer, even down to the mash. That, for example, there's no calcium in here. Calcium is an important part of the mash for the enzymatic activity to convert starches to sugars. So without it, I'm not really sure how this mash is going to go. So that's flaw number 1, but we're definitely not stopping there. Treated versus untreated water is something we've tested before. A few years back, we brewed a hazy IPA where one batch was brewed with treated distilled water that included gypsum, calcium chloride, Epsom salt, table salt, and lactic acid. The second batch, well, that just used plain old untreated distilled water. And during the brew day, there were some observable differences. So for example, the mash pH for the treated water was lower than the untreated mash. But the original gravity of both beers came out the same, 1056. After fermentation, the treated beer had a final gravity of 1.010 and the untreated beer had attenuated a little further to 1.007. Visually though, the beers looked near identical. But could participants tell them apart? A total of 16 people took our triangle test, where participants were served 2 samples of the treated water beer and 1 sample of the untreated water beer. At this sample size, 9 tasters would have to identify the unique sample in order to reach statistical significance, but only 4 made the accurate selection. So our first flaw in my compounding flaws pale ale was not one that was reliably detectable in an experiment with a hazy IPA. Got my beer grains ready to go here, and what I've got in this recipe is pretty simple malt bill. It's 80% pale malt. I'm actually using foundation malt from Epiphany Craft Malt, and I have 16% Munich malt, and then I have 4% of Crystal 45. Now flaw number 2 is the mash temperature. Set it to 160 Fahrenheit. That's a little bit on the high side. I'll explain what that'll do in a sec, but yeah, let's get these grains in. And this, by the way, is a smaller batch than usual. I'm just brewing a 3-gallon batch today. Not that I think this is going to be a terrible beer or anything, but I don't really want 5 gallons of potentially flawed beer to get rid of. All right, so mash temperature, what's the impact of this? Well, what we're doing here is we're using this warm water to convert starches into sugars. The way that we do that is primarily through 2 enzymes in the malt, alpha amylase and beta amylase. Now, beta amylase tend to work best around 60 to 65 Celsius, and those convert the starches into simple sugars. Simple sugars that the yeast during fermentation will be happy to chomp away with. And what tends to happen is a mash that favors beta amylase will mean lots of simple sugars, the yeast will consume them, and you will end up with a higher attenuation and a lower final gravity in the beer. But there's also alpha amylase. Now, these are happiest at around 70 or 158 Fahrenheit. So those will create longer chain sugars, which the yeast will not so easily be able to consume. And the result is you'll have a higher final gravity, most likely, at the end of fermentation. Now, we do have to consider that these are temperature ranges where the alpha and beta amylase are most optimal. They certainly work at other temperatures as well. So even though I'm mashing quite high here, over 160 Fahrenheit, that's going to favor alpha amylase, but there will be some beta amylase enzymes active still, converting some simpler sugars, I expect, I don't know. But it'll be very interesting to see where the final gravity of this beer finishes, considering we are mashing so high. And by the way, why this flaw? How could this happen? With these all-in-one brewing systems, it's very easy just to set a temperature and basically stick to it. But I have had situations where my mash temperature has got too high or too low. One reason is sometimes these things will overshoot or undershoot the temperature a little bit. And one of the causes for that is if you don't have your thermometer all the way in the thermal well. I've had it where it's kind of stuck halfway out and it will register a much lower temperature than is really in the mash, so you actually end up mashing way too warm. You see it dropping already as I've moved it a little bit out here. So let's put it back in so it gets the real temperature. I'm going to mash for about 40-45 minutes, and we'll see if this double flaw effect of having no minerals in the water and you mashing at a very high temperature, how that affects the gravity of the beer. Mash temperature is something we've tested many times. There are a bunch of experiments to choose from, so I went back to the very first one we did on the topic, which evaluated the impact of mash temperature on two blonde ales, one mashed at 147 Fahrenheit or 64 C, and the other at 161 Fahrenheit or 72 C. The beers were mashed at these temperatures for 1 hour. There was very little difference between the two beers in terms of original gravity, but the difference became much more apparent when taking final gravity readings. 1.005 for the low mash temp beer and 1.014 for the high mash temp. The higher beta amylase activity in the low mash temp beer did indeed appear to have created more fermentable sugars for the yeast to consume. But while the hungry yeast could tell a difference, could participants? Well, tasters received 2 samples of the low mash temp batch and 1 sample of the high mash temp beer. Of the 20 participants, 11 would have to accurately select the unique sample, but only 9 did. And this despite the low mash temp beer clocking in with a 1% higher ABV. Now, other mash temp experiments across different beer styles have produced different results, like this English porter that did come back significant. But clearly the difference is not always easy to detect. Now, next up, I'll be adding hops, which is the perfect time to discuss today's sponsor, Yakima Valley Hops. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. I'm using Yakima Valley hops in every batch I brew. Yakima Valley hops carry everything from classics like Cascade to modern favourites like Galaxy and Mosaic and many, many more. Homebrewers can select specific crop years and most hops come in 2, 8 and 16 ounce packages. I personally love using the 8 ounce bags, which gives me plenty of hops for a brew day, and I can store any leftovers in my freezer for use in future brews. Head over to yakimavalleyhops.com to see everything they have to offer. So I ended up mashing for an hour. Now, how did the pre-boil conversion go? Well, my brewing software said I would expect around 1047 for my pre-boil gravity. I took a reading. What did I get considering I didn't add any water salts? 1050. It actually outperformed what the brewing software expected a mash at 160 Fahrenheit would do based on my usual efficiency rate. So apparently the lack of water salts and the lack of calcium didn't have too much of a problem, at least for conversion. So let's move on to flaw number 3, and that relates to boil temperature. I'm going to deliberately keep this at around 200 Fahrenheit or about 93 or 94 Celsius. I'm going to do that by just dialing down the percentage of power that I'm sending to my heating element. I need to experiment with this. I'm going to try 25%. Normally I'm at 50%. Now, maintaining a rolling boil for me is never a problem with this 240 system, but if you're using a 120 system, it can be difficult to maintain a rolling boil. So this is a flaw I wanted to test. So a weaker boil I think is going to affect isomerization. We're just not going to extract as much hop oils if we're at a slightly lower temperature, I would expect. Other concerns you might have about not having a rolling boil are DMS, but I have no concerns about DMS. And I'm going to do this as a 30-minute boil, which you might consider a flaw in itself because it's not the 60-minute boil, but absolute nonsense. I've done so many beers with 30-minute boils and not had any problems with that. We have a couple of experiments on boil vigor. I've picked one for an American amber ale because we have the video footage of the difference in boil vigor. Nice. There was a drastic difference in post-boil volume. The strong boil batch had 1.25 gallons more boil off than the batch boiled gently. Now that would have resulted in a big OG difference, so the strong boiled batch was topped off with distilled water, resulting in both beers having the same original gravity. The finished beers were presented to 21 participants, 12 needed to identify the unique sample for statistical significance, and nope, only 11 did. On top of that, former Brülosophy contributor Ray Found, who brewed the beers, failed to pick out the unique sample in any of his semi-blind triangle tests, an experience that I'm quite familiar with. Now, in terms of the hops that I'm going to be adding, well, I've got two. I'm using Lupamax Amarillo for my bittering hop. That's going in at the start of the 30-minute boil, 15 grams, giving about 40 IBU of bitterness. At 15 minutes, I'm adding 10 grams of Cascade, and then at flame out, it's back in with more of the Lupamax Amarillo, 20 grams of that going in at the end, and that's it for hops. I'm pretty close to 200 Fahrenheit now, so I think we're going to say this is the start of the boil that's not really a boil, and in with that first hop addition of Amarillo. Not your usual bittering hop, but this stuff has got pretty high alpha acids, so I figured I'd use it. At the end of the boil, I chilled the wort and then transferred it into my sanitized fermenter, and then took an original gravity reading. Now, because there wasn't really a boil, there was still steam coming off of this thing, but nowhere near as much as you'd normally get. So I was curious to see what my boil off rate would be. Well, I went from 1050 to 1054. And my brewing software said that I should have got to 1055 as my original gravity. So I ended up overachieving on the mash somehow, and as I expected, I didn't do quite so well with the boil, but I've ended up at the right number. So it's time for flaw number 4. And well, this is the one I'm honestly least worried about, and it's to pitch old yeast. So this is a packet of yeast from Imperial Yeast, and it says on the packet to use it within 4 months. And when I look at the manufacturer date, I'm actually at 6 months. So this is considered old, expired yeast at this point. But look, these are effectively double pitches in that they start off with 200 billion cells. And I kept this in the fridge the whole time, so it's been looked after over those 6 months. And I really think this isn't going to be a problem. Also, it's not a particularly high gravity beer, and I only made 3 gallons of it. So pitching this in and fermenting at 68 Fahrenheit, that's around 20 Celsius. The closest experiment to this relates to a strong bitter, where one batch received yeast that was 1 month old versus a batch using a 4-month-old yeast of the same strain. Now, based on commonly accepted assumptions about viability loss over time, this would equate to the fresh pouch having approximately 160 billion yeast cells, while the older pouch would be closer to about 80 billion cells. The fresher yeast batch showed visible signs of fermentation earlier, and after a week, the fresh yeast batch was at 1.008, while the older yeast batch had only reached 1.013. However, a week later, both beers had the same final gravity of 1.008. After 10 days of conditioning, the beer made with the older yeast on the right here was notably more cloudy, but a couple of weeks later the beers looked much more similar. And when put to the test of the 20 participants, only 8 could identify the unique sample, indicating participants were unable to reliably distinguish the beers. So the 4 flaws I've introduced into my beer have all come back as non-significant when tested separately. So how did my pale ale fare? Well, it fermented as expected down to 1.011 Fg, and I packaged the beer to a keg. Now, I didn't make two beers here, like one with flaws and then one without. So this isn't a Brülosophy experiment. We're just going to go with subjective opinion. But when it came time to taste my beer, both Will and I were very much of the same mindset as to how this came out. All right, well, I've got a beer for you today.
All right.
I have not tried this either.
Oh,
but
all right.
I am very curious to see how this beer turns out.
It's a little hazy. You said it was a pale ale.
Yeah.
So maybe some hop haze.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, let's see what we get on the aroma for this.
What do I get much? I feel like I get some malt.
No, not a lot of hop aroma. Let's go for the taste.
Okay.
See what we get.
All right.
Oh, that wasn't what I was expecting.
Yeah, me either. I don't get hops.
Nope. I'm also not getting the... I was expecting more of a malty character.
Yeah.
Based on the aroma and the appearance. I'm not really getting that either. So it's not hoppy. And there's not much maltiness.
I don't even know how to describe what I'm tasting. It's not the most pleasant taste.
No. It's terribly disappointing.
That's what I'm struggling with.
But it's not like, ugh, that taste, that's gross. It's just like a lack of flavor to me. I'm not really picking up much at all, much of anything.
Yeah, it's kind of very muted.
I'm looking at this and thinking like bread, cracker crust, that sort of thing.
Or like a caramely note or something.
Yeah, or something, right, a bit of sweetness. There's not that either.
It is confusing because you look at it, I mean, it looks pretty nice. Great foam, good head and retention. And then smelled kind of caramely a little bit, and then it's just not there.
It's not there. It tastes so much to me like beer that's been sat around for way too long and all of the hop flavor has left it.
Yeah.
And the maltiness is like faded away and you're just left with like this fizzy kind of brown thing.
Yeah, like a nice dry stale beer. Like a stale piece of bread.
Stale bread beer. In the end, this process, well, it did still make beer, and it's drinkable, I suppose, but it could have been so much better. Now, is that a compounding effect of introducing so many flaws? Or does this all come down to one single flaw ruining the batch? It's basically impossible to say, of course, but for my money, I'm thinking it's probably most likely the untreated reverse osmosis water. I won't be doing that again in a hurry. You know, I actually felt quite bad for subjecting Will to this beer, not least because on the same day I also served him my stale CTZ pale lager that had been sitting on Trube for 6 months.
You should have probably chugged this about 4 months ago.
Yeah. Do come back, Will. I can do better. Speaking of, I previously brewed a disappointing English IPA and then used suggestions from the YouTube comment section to try to fix my mistakes and rebrew it. Could the internet fix my bad beer? Find out in this video here.